Okay, welcome everyone to this Humanities Institute event. Some of my favorite people here, so great to see you all. I'm going to start out with something a bit personal before we go into today's work, which is that when I was first asked to write for an art venue on some living artists, I was hugely, I panicked absolutely. I had a headache, I was nauseous, I was like, no, you don't understand. I write about dead people, you know, and 200 years ago, and what I say is not going to particularly shift the needle on them. So why am I doing this, right? There's a lot at stake, their careers, my career, you know, the value of their art. And so it was really difficult. Then, of course, later I thought, well, wait a minute, and we've seen this a lot, that the humanities have something to say. Maybe we should be writing for different publics. But then there's that sense of exposure. Wait, someone's actually going to read my work, and they're going to line edit it? Like, they're going to actually work at the level of the word and the line? And that can be a scary and vulnerable process. It can also be an incredibly exciting process. The possibilities and opportunities of this kind of work are important. There's much more, there's a lot at stake. And it speaks to the value of the humanities in a different way. And I'd like to think that all of you are here because of that. And so thank you for that. Thank you for coming here, for being willing to participate in a difficult process of putting yourself out there, putting your work out there, and in ways that are different from the scale of tenure, right? So it's like, I'm not going to get tenure with my article that got in the Washington Post or something like that, or an Esquire, but those are valuable and important things. And for those of you who have tenure, what else is tenure for, right? What is tenure for but the opportunity to take chances and think about scholarship on a different stage, to think about thinking differently. And so to help us to do that, we have two wonderful and experienced folks who have been doing a lot of these things. Torie Bosch, whose work engages with the intersection of technology, culture, and critique. She is first opinion editor of Stat, a leading venue for authoritative journalism about health, medicine, and the life sciences. Bosch was previously editor of Future Tense. You may know her from that venue, a Washington, D.C. based collaboration between Slate magazine, Arizona State University, and New America. Her edited collection, You Are Not Expected to Understand This, How 26 Lines of Code Changed the World, was published by Princeton University Press last year and tells the human stories behind computer programming. And then Andrés Martinez, professor of practice at the Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, special advisor to Michael Crow, global sports scholar, editorial director of Future Tense at ASU, and columnist for Mexico City's Reforma newspaper. And good to have you in residence here in Tempe. Prior to coming to ASU, Martinez directed the Fellows Program at the New America Foundation. After having worked for 4 newspapers, including as an editorial board member of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Los Angeles Times. And across the arc of his work, Martinez is dedicated to advancing media and research partnerships for ASU in both Mexico and Washington. Martinez writes and speaks often on the future of technology, media, sports, and the U.S.-Mexico relationship, and is completing a book project on sports and globalization. So please join me in welcoming them here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having us here. I left Future Tense about 8 years ago, and it's really, or 8 years, Jesus, 8 months ago. And it's so wonderful to be back in Arizona and with Arizona State. And I have to warn you that I'm probably going to say "we" to refer to future tense a bunch by accident, because I'm going to fall right back into my spiel. Yes, so please forgive me if I'm sort of like, slipping back into time into when I was officially an ASU person.
You never really leave.
No, that's right. It's the Hotel California, as like 4 people told me when I said that I was going to be leaving for STAT. I'm really excited to be back here, and this is going to be a fairly informal session. So Andres and I have about a little less than 2 hours of content planned, but we really welcome people to hop in with questions as we go. I think it's really awful to sit through being talked to for 2 hours, God forbid. So if you want some clarification on something as we're going, please do feel free to speak up. We may be getting to your question in like the next slide or something, so we'll just say, in the interest of time, we're going to get right back to you on that one, because we do want to keep things moving, but this should be really participatory. Any other things you want to say before I jump right in? Okay. Well, I was delighted with Ron's introduction, because my first question with these sorts of workshops is always, why do we want to do this kind of writing? So that's us, you don't need to see that. So, I think most people say they want to write for the public to change the discourse, and that is fantastic, and I love it. We want to affect public policy. I think especially as humanities people at this moment, it's really important to be engaging with the public on what the humanities have to offer the rest of the world, especially as humanities are sort of in crisis right now. I also think it's really important to hold organizations and people to account. So I have a screenshot here from an article that I ran in STAT several months ago by a privacy researcher who noticed that her OB's office, she had very strategically declined to share her information every time she checked in at the OB's office. And somehow her information got shared anyway. And she just emailed me last night to say that she went back to that doctor's office and realized that the third-party company responsible for the breach had actually changed her form. And it's almost certainly because she published a piece saying that the form was inadequate and her information had been shared without her permission. So it was just really great in terms of timing to show that like people read this stuff, it's really important. The thing no one ever wants to admit is that this is also really good for you as a person, right? Like, it's really exciting for people to actually read what you write, especially if you're used to only a small group of people reading it. One of my favorite examples from my time at Future Tense was an intellectual property attorney and thinker wrote a piece that was, I think, about the patent wars over Klondike bars in the early 20th century, which was just a delightful piece of history. And when he got home that night, his kid's babysitter was really excited to talk to him about it. And she had never expressed any interest in intellectual property before. And it was one of those moments for him in that, by taking a different approach to the stuff he worked on every day, he was able to reach somebody who didn't think she cared. So, there's that sort of sense. This can also be great for you. We had in terms of getting access to information, a Future Tense frequent contributor, Josephine Wolf, who studies cyber insurance, once wrote a piece about the lack of data on cybersecurity insurance for her research, and an insurance company reached out to her that week and offered her access to a data set, which she was then able to use. There were two criminology professors at ASU who once wrote a Future Tense piece. They couldn't answer a question I had asked in an edit, and then they ended up writing a grant proposal to research something related to that question. So the process of being edited by someone who does not understand what you do can sometimes make you think about your work in a new way. And then, of course, you can get on NPR, or you can get on CNN. We had a professor get on CNN once after doing something. It can be really great. Are there any other reasons that people are interested in doing this kind of writing? I'd always love to add more to my list. Yes, please.
Change the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Love it. Yeah.
Oh, here's a good one. I'm working on a piece for Outside Magazine or Runner's World. And so if I can publish that piece, there's a tax write-off for all of my money here.
I love that one. That's brilliant.
This is getting very real very quickly.
I used that once. I used that once to go on a Backstreet Boys cruise when I wrote a feature about it for BuzzFeed News. It was the best assignment of my life.
Torie has range.
I sure do, yeah. We can talk, if everyone wants to talk about it later, let me know. I took great photos. So yeah, sometimes you get paid. The New York Times op-ed page pays people, and we can also talk more about payment later on. It doesn't always happen, especially with academics, but I think the culture is changing, so there can be some very minimal remunerative benefits to this. I don't want to oversell them. Anything else to make this feel appealing? Okay. So I see some familiar faces here, so I know some folks have done this kind of writing. Christy, I'm not going to pick on you yet, but I will. Has anyone done this kind of writing and want to talk maybe about what felt good or bad or weird about it? Please.
I did a piece with The Conversation here, and the editing was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. How so?
Because the editor, well, they edited. Like my editor at my university press was really just a project manager, I realized. So they edited, and they weren't that familiar with the subject matter, and so they introduced these kinds of like more snazzy transitions and stuff like that, which was cool. But then they sort of said things that were wrong, you know, or that just sort of like brought it to sort of put it in a little bit more like formulaic, like, oh, this might be going in that direction. And so then it was my job, which I enjoyed, to sort of try and keep the good stylistic moves they were putting in, but add more accuracy and sort of nuance back. And that was a really interesting back and forth.
I'm so glad you said that, and that's something we're going to talk about in a bit too, is once your pitch has been accepted, how do you work with an editor in a way that preserves you and your voice and your reputation? You know, as Ron says, this is kind of scary writing, while also sort of like recognizing where they kind of know what they're doing, right? So like, where do you sort of say like, maybe I'm not going to fight that, and where do you stand up for, you know, the accuracy in particular? So yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote this for the conversation too. What I think was interesting to me is that they didn't want you to take a position, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm a philosopher, and you know, we argue for positions, and so I mean, even though we try to acknowledge, you know, opposing arguments and stuff, but so that was kind of tough, you know, because I'm, you know, anyway, it was just new. But yeah, the editing, I mean, academic journal, even when I started, you know, publishing many years ago now, they used to do more vigorous editing, except law reviews, but then they're all kids, right? And they edit every line you do, so I publish a lot of law reviews too. But that was, I mean, I think it's really nice. I love people to, you know, groom my writing, because it's, you know.
Yeah, are there any lawyers in the room? I'm so glad, because lawyers.
Hey. I was a lawyer for 10 minutes.
We've talked about that. Yeah. Lawyers are the worst to edit because they view it as an inherently adversarial process. Everyone else seems to get that you're not winning if you bully me into keeping the original. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one other thing that we'll talk about, and we'll get to this in a second with Andrés, is that different outlets have different styles. So when you write for most of the places that we're going to talk about, they want you to take an opinion. The Conversation has a very particular approach. So we'll talk a bit about, you know, how to find the outlet that works for the style of writing that you're most interested in doing.
So I wrote for The Conversation as well, but I also wrote for the Smithsonian Magazine.
Yeah.
And so this is like embedded in what I'm about to say as a question. So that piece of writing was different because it came from a book. It was like kind of distill an article, distill your argument from this book into an article. And the type of writing I want to do now is not necessary. It stems from all of my knowledge and my research, but it's not coming from a book. So I think that process, I imagine, will be very different.
Yeah, and it's, as someone who has published a lot of book excerpts and adapted excerpts and otherwise book-related pieces, it is a bit different, right? Because for the one thing, you're literally trying to sell something. But we can talk a bit about kind of the different approaches there too.
One other thing I think as academics, like we cite everything, right?
Oh.
And of course, we're just so used to, and so that was, it's just painful, and it feels a little fraudulent too.
Oh, we have a slide, don't you worry, yes. I spend 20% of my life negotiating sources with people, so yes, we will get to that, I promise, absolutely, yeah. Great, so that's kind of sort of the overview of what we're going to be doing. So I'm going to kick it on over to Andres now.
One more question.
Yes, please.
Just on this, make a name for yourself. I think that's really interesting, and maybe you have more influence with a name to do good things other than for your own career. And I feel a little trepidatious about that as well. In particular, we just had one of our faculty attacked on campus. Many of my, I don't know how many, but some of my colleagues get death threats. Their classrooms have to be taken down from public listings. So like the potential of attracting that kind of attention is intimidating.
Absolutely, and we can talk a little bit more about sort of protecting yourself online, and in particular how to work with any publication you're working with, because so my job as an editor is first to protect my writer. So whatever I publish, the writer is and their safety is my first priority. I've had very, very few writers receive attacks based on things they've published, but it's something I'm always aware is a possibility, and I believe it's my responsibility to help them navigate that. I do often tend to flag for people like, hey, this might be tricky. Are you sure you want to publish it? If people are writing very controversial things. Animals often people don't realize are going to be fraught, but they are fraught. So sometimes I'll ask someone like, did you see what happened to someone who published this piece? Do you want to take 2 weeks if it's very personal to think about it and talk to family members before we hit publish? So one thing I think you should do is try to get a sense for who you're comfortable working with as an editor. Someone at the New York Times is probably not going to necessarily have the time to do that. If someone who's at more of a sort of like, strong but not quite as powerful and popular outlet like me at Stat, we'll have a little bit more time to work with you on things like that. So I think that's important, is getting a sense from friends and colleagues who have published somewhere and had a good experience. I think it can be helpful. And then also just sort of thinking through the argument and what feels like it's worth making, right? I mean, there are hot takes that are not worth risks, and then there are takes that are worth the risk sometimes. So just thinking those things through for sure. And we can talk more about that too. All right, so now Andres, let's see, we've talked about this. Andres is now going to give the guide to styles of writing and some of the outlets here that we can use.
Yeah, I mean, just continuing the conversation, when you think, just to think a little bit about the landscape that we're talking about, right? Torie and I often talk about, when we were doing Future Tense, that we were kind of in the ideas journalism space. I think the conversation calls what they do explanatory journalism, which might be another good term for it. So I was just kind of thinking about the breakdown of what the landscape looks like. There's so much more diversity now. I mean, as you are well aware, media has had a challenging time, and we've been saying this. I started working in newspapers in the 90s, and we were starting to talk about the challenging times, and then it was a time of transition. Turns out it's a generational transition in terms of people figuring out the business model. But in that period, while it's been very challenging and existentially dire for local journalism, which is where the crisis is really acute, there's also been a lot of great experimentation. I mean, you've had things like The Conversation and what we were trying to do at Future Tense, and you have a lot of really good new niche digital publications, and we could probably come up with our own list of those depending on our own interests. I started reading recently this small publication called Puck, which covers like the intersection of culture and business and Hollywood really, really well. But there's so many publications like that. Semaphore is another new digital one. But, when you go classic and you think about the news, there's the newspaper world, which 40, 50 years ago, if we were having this conversation, we would be so focused, right, on publishing op-eds and newspapers, unless you were doing some kind of longer narrative form in a magazine like Esquire or The Atlantic. But again, you now have a proliferation of news outlets that are kind of beyond your traditional, the newspaper world. This realm that I'm loosely calling ideas journalism, which we'll talk more about. And then there's sort of this interesting, new space of these collaborative efforts like The Conversation that have a very interesting model of they work with you, they publish you, and then they syndicate their content. So the same way in which, the Associated Press and others would syndicate news stories to other outlets that wanted to pick it up, The Conversation and some other outlets are doing that in the sort of idea space and arguments and columns. The newspaper terminology, this is sort of a backward-looking explanation, but it always amazed me, even working in DC, like how people in Capitol Hill, for example, would always confuse this terminology of the newspapers. You'd have a senator say they wrote an editorial in the New York Times. So for what it's worth, just in terms of the terminology, editorials traditionally in newspapers were the unsigned pieces that spoke for the institution. And that's kind of a dying art or an anachronism. Like the New York Times, you all remember what this is. Some of you might be too young. So in the old days, all kind of metro newspapers in the United States, including the New York Times, would have, editorial spaces, and there'd be 2 opinion pages, right? Elsewhere in the newspaper, the idea was there's no opinion. This is where the institution gets to tell you what they really think. And this is the editorial page was the one place where the publisher, the owner of the outlet, could act as sort of a civic agent and advocate for things for the community or for the country. And the whole pretense was it wasn't going to influence what was on the front page, right? That convention was sort of tested in terms of people's faith in that division of news and opinion. And even now, the New York Times now has sort of moved away from having editorials. So when I was at the New York Times, and also in Pittsburgh and in LA, I was part of this editorial board where we would come up with the positions of the institution and write as a collective in the royal we. And it is, you could quickly sense why this is a little bit dated in the 20s, right? People don't want to hear from institutions and have this trust. They'd rather hear from personalities. And so the New York Times still runs editorials from time to time, but they don't feel like they need to run 3 or 4 every day. So now you have, op-eds, columns. Does anybody know where the term op-ed comes from? So it's funny, again, this would be the editorials in the old days, and then you'd have letters to the editor. And then this was always the op-ed page, and it was literally a design term within the sort of newspaper graphics. It's the page that's opposite the editorial page. You couldn't always call it A15 because some days the A section would be longer than others. So, and in some newspapers, the opinion section might be in the B section. So this idea was, it was a design term, and the distinction between op-eds and columns, because again, you might, have a senator or professor say, I wrote a column in the New York Times. If it's a one-off, submission from the outside, it's an op-ed, not a column. So a column has this, refers to, there's a recurring relationship. You write weekly, you're Gail Collins, you're not Professor at ASU submitting. But the terms are changing, interestingly, because of the sort of why, if you're no longer going to have editorials, it's hard to have op-eds. So the New York Times just last year, or the year before, with great fanfare, said they're now guest essays. So this is just good to know about, and also understanding terminology in other realms. It kind of gets to what Torie talks a lot about, and it's going to be a recurring theme today, about knowing your audience. I think when we often talk about knowing your audience, it's knowing the kind of readers you're trying to reach, which is going to inform your choice of outlet. But also part of your first audience is the gatekeeper. It's the Torie Bosches, the editors that you're going to need to work with. So it's not a great start to approach, the New York Times op-ed page editor and say, hey, I want to write an editorial on X, because you're already starting off by showing that you kind of don't understand, their world. And they might be plenty forgiving of that. But it's just, again, good to sort of know the terminology. So this is, the Washington Post has also moved away from the op-ed term, and they're calling them now guest opinions. But again, the distinction is, if you click on columns, you're going to see their stable of, and they have a pretty large one, of political columnists who write with regularity. So again, the ideas journalism space, this is not an exhaustive list, but again, this is a sort of sample of the kinds of publications where you can advance an argument based on your research, right?
If I may,
Yeah, please.
They're general interest places where you can...
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, certainly if you're in tech, Wired is a great option, or Tech Review. So, but yeah, these are the ones where if you really want to reach that smart public that are not kind of focused on a particular topic and don't have that expertise, these are all wonderful options.
Zocalo Public Square, I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's based in LA, lots of great humanities content. It's another one, like Future Tense, it's sort of part of the ASU Media Enterprises. They have a fantastic editorial team. They do a lot of events in LA as well. So some pieces that might work for the conversation might also work for Zocalo. They also have the same kind of approach of syndicating their content, making it available at no charge to other publications. The Boston Globe, again, Metro newspaper, but has always had a really strong kind of opinion section that's not just, pro or con, arguments on a particular issue of relevance to Boston, but kind of a broader take on things.
Also, if I may, we're going to send out a cheat sheet to everybody with a lot of this information. So if you want to take pictures of the slides, you're very welcome to, but also we're going to send with the list of these outlets and structure tips and all that too. So don't worry too much about that.
And it's interesting what one of you said about the conversation. They are very careful about, a lot of publications now want to be in the sort of explanatory space and provide analysis, and are a little bit shy about like leaning in with a strong position and argument. Whereas the traditional op-ed page of a newspaper and Slate sort of,
Oh, yeah.
would be allergic to a piece that doesn't take a strong stand. And so, again, there's a lot of diversity in terms of approach when we talk about general interest media where you can advance these arguments. I think the conversation feels like they don't want to alienate their funders, and they want to be, they have a certain understanding of what it means to provide sort of academic context to ongoing controversies, and it's not necessarily for them to provide the strong, pro or con on an issue, but just to provide more context, right? Which can be very valuable. And so these are some other examples of places that are doing a similar approach to the conversation in terms of providing a bridge between academia and the public square, if we can call it that. Project Syndicate is very op-ed focused. I've never really worked with them or know them that well, but there are a lot of people who have kind of a recurrent, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is the CEO at New America, which is the other partner at Future Tense. She writes a lot for Project Syndicate, and I think it's sort of a relationship that you develop where you write op-eds with some frequency, and if you go to their page, it looks great, like the conversations, but it's the same concept, that they make it available to others. Monkey Cage, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Monkey Cage. It's a very well-regarded political science collaboration that for many years, I think it started independently, and then it was kind of on the Post. The Washington Post for a while had Monkey Cage and Made by History. And these are two interesting, again, experiments where you had academics at various universities with a knack for doing what we're talking about today, who partnered up with a publication, kind of the way we partnered up with Slate, and they were providing the content, and then it would appear on the Washington Post. They would hand it off to the Washington Post, and then it would get copy edited or something. But it was this interesting collaboration. The Post has decided to move sort of away from that. So now the Monkey Cage went back to being independent, and Made by History is now attached to Time magazine. So it's different than The Conversation because it only appears on Time, but they do really great stuff. Victoria Jackson, who some of you might know, has written for them. So a lot of you, it sounds like, are familiar with The Conversation, but again, a wide range of topics. This is what it looks like. So if you go to their website, you'll see, they even have the university in the byline, and the model is that you're a member as a school, and that gives you a lot of access. And we have a colleague with ASU Media Enterprise named Suzanne Wilson, who is sort of like the main contact for The Conversation from the ASU side. This is Project Syndicate, and this is Made by History, which again started up with Time. Time magazine has this tab called Ideas, and Made by History, they might have 3 or 4 pieces a week, and they're pretty good. I mean, the editors there are very talented. Yeah.
Thanks. Any questions on that sort of landscape terminology stuff? Awesome. All right, so the trickiest part about this writing sometimes is the need to move fast. So, there are a few, of course, modes of this sort of writing, but what's going to get the most eyeballs will be something that is news related in one sense or another. If you are a leading expert in a niche field and all of a sudden your field is in the news, that is the moment you want to write. And it can be kind of a little bit scary, but that's a moment when people care more than they normally do about whatever this highly specific field is. And so you really want to try to take advantage of that. If there's a moment in which all of a sudden friends and family members are asking you about something that normally you have to convince them to listen to you talk about, that is a moment to try to write right away. And when we say right away, I mean, it really does have to be fast, especially if it's at a New York Times or Washington Post. It might be the next day, probably that week. The following week is going to be too late, which is really deeply unfortunate, but also just a reality. Much of our traffic on these kinds of sites comes from people Googling something they hadn't heard of before or something they're only vaguely familiar with. And so, you really want people's attention, you want to write your piece while they're still Googling. If they've stopped Googling, it's often too late for a general interest publication, which is unfortunate. Sometimes you can have the idea and wait until there's a news hook, as we call it. I will say we're going to talk a bit about the need to stay away from jargon, and I'm going to apologize for some hypocrisy here, because while journalists always talk about everyone else's jargon, we're very unapologetic about our jargon, which is terrible. But our jargon will include news hook or news peg to talk about a reason to hang a piece on something in the news. We'll talk about the lead and the kicker and the nut graph, and I'm really sorry about that. But as I said, there are other types of news pegs for pieces, so anniversaries, holidays, pop culture, so it doesn't have to be something that's happening in the news. And this is when I started talking about jargon. You can often have the idea for a piece and then look for the news hook. So sometimes you sort of have the argument and you're just waiting, you know someone's going to care about this soon. So my favorite example of this is this poor guy has no idea that for the last 7 years I've been using him as my example. He is an expert on exploding batteries, which is not a field people talk about that often, but several months before we published this, he started pitching me a piece on the risk of exploding batteries. But I just had the sense that people weren't going to care until there were lots of batteries exploding.
If he was right, there would be a news peg.
Yes, exactly. And so I told him, like, I think we need to wait until there's a news hook and people start to care. And he must have set up a Google News alert, because anytime a battery exploded in Berlin, I would get an email from him and I'd say, no, when I say a news hook, I mean something that people have heard about, right? Not just people who care about batteries in Berlin. But then the Samsung Galaxies started to explode. And we had this piece basically ready to go. And we just had to slap a new intro and a few sprinkles throughout the piece on what was happening. And this piece did huge traffic. It was this first really smart piece of the news cycle, I think, because this was someone who knew what he was talking about, rather than a poor tech reporter who all of a sudden had to like scramble to call. So sometimes I think you all have a gut feeling about when something is coming down the pipeline. So, you know, take advantage of that. Think through the argument that's going to be useful when this thing you know will happen will happen. It's really frustrating sometimes to publish a perspective piece or prospective piece that says this is a problem nobody's talking about, because the thing is, hypotheticals are hard to land with an audience sometimes. I found this a lot as a tech editor, that hypothetical technological harms, by which I don't normally mean actual maiming, I mean more sort of like invasions of privacy. It's hard to get people to conceptualize, and so often it starts to come across as sort of like fear-mongering. And so, you know, that's something to balance. It's satisfying to be the person who said, I warned you about this, but also it's hard to get people's attention without overstating risks. So balancing that kind of like, when do I want to be the first person warning versus giving context when something has happened is something worth sort of puzzling through, depending on. But yeah, so back to this.
Can I say something about
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think this concept of the news peg is so important, and it's often misunderstood because, as Torie well described it, you're you know, if you think about a Venn diagram, you can have a big circle of the things that you care about, and then over here you have a big circle of what's in the news and what's, I mean, the brilliance of the conversation, that publication is the name, right? The whole idea is that there is an ongoing conversation that you're adding to, right? So the key is to figure out where is the intersection between the thing that's important to you that you are researching, and you feel everybody should pay attention to it, but you get the jurisdiction to get into these publications by figuring out the intersection of where that connects with what's in the news, what's in the conversation. And what's often confusing is, you know, sometimes when I as an editor would reach out to, you know, Professor Smith and say, Professor Smith, you are the battery expert, or in this case, I forget the name, but, you know, or, and then the professor might be like, okay, but I haven't followed that incident, and I don't want to write about that. It's not, it's just the excuse. It's the peg in which, and then you pivot to really write the piece that you want to write. Mm-hmm. But it's almost like the thing, I mean, to be lawyerly, because since Torie loves lawyers, it gives you almost like the jurisdiction. So for example, I write a lot about, you know, I think a lot about, and I do a lot of work on the U.S.-Mexico relationship. If I wanted to go to the Post or the LA Times or the New York Times today and say, you know, we really need to rethink how we think about Mexico, and it's kind of out of the blue, they're going to be like, okay, but why today, why now, right? They're focused on the 6 things that are kind of in the mix. So I'm already thinking about the next peg, and next week there is another Republican debate. Presidential debate, except for minus the candidate who's going to be the nominee. I know that there will be crazy things said about Mexico. I don't want to write 1,000 words about the Republican debate, but I know that there will be a line in there that will be a great peg to say, you know, Ron DeSantis or Tim Scott said this about the border and compared it to X. And unfortunately, this is too symptomatic of Washington's misunderstanding. And then I can write the rest of the piece about what I really want to tell you about what you should know about the U.S.-Mexico relationship. But oftentimes when you have this negotiation as an editor, the person thinks like suddenly I'm asking them to write, you know, an 800-word column kind of like on the debate, and they're like, ew, or that's not my thing. But it's the concept of the peg. Like that is just my excuse to get into my topic. Sorry.
Exactly. So like the batteries, that piece didn't talk too much about Samsung and the reaction, right? It was much more about, this is a thing we always knew was be a problem. Here's what I've been thinking about that no one wanted to listen to me say before, really. I think, though, that as Andrés sort of gestured to here when he was saying that a professor might say, well, I haven't followed that story, it's a really, I often ask people at these kinds of workshops, what do you read? You know, what general interest outlets do you read? And often people will admit they don't read any. And I get it, you're very busy people, you have a ton of reading to do, but if you really want to do this kind of writing for the public, you have to read what kind of writing is happening for the public. You really need to have a sense of how people are or are not talking about your topic. Because one of the things we're going to be talking about in a minute is that you really need your piece to be oriented within the discourse on the topic. So you need a sense of where people have blind spots, misunderstandings, could use context. So being somewhat aware of the news cycle is going to be really critical for this. You know, I often get pitches from people who say, well, this really important person died 4 months ago. And you know, first of all, it's often someone I've never heard of, and so that's going to be really tricky for me. But it's also 4 months, it's just hard. It's not necessarily going to resonate with people. So having that kind of understanding of what your audience wants to read is going to be really important by having a sense of what they're already reading. I really think it's important to pay attention to what your friends and family members are saying, what they're asking you about, where their eyes glaze over and where they kind of light up a little bit is going to be a really great indicator. Where your kid's babysitter might finally get interested is going to be really important. And the last thing I'll say, and this is largely related to, well, frankly, both my time at Future Tense and now at STAT, but more so at STAT, awareness days, weeks, and months are not great news hooks. I cannot tell you how many pitches I get every day for an awareness day, week, or month, and Cybersecurity Awareness Month was the bane of my existence at Future Tense. Readers don't care. It's just made up by PR people. It's just not a thing, generally speaking. So try to.
That's not true of like Black History Month.
Well, okay, I will.
Gets contacted a lot.
Oh, right, yeah. There are some very limited exceptions, but like Pancreatic Cancer Awareness Week, nobody knows about.
Holidays would
Yes.
sort of be more in the category.
Yeah, holidays, anniversaries, like I said up there, those sorts of things, those can work as news hooks. But if the average person hasn't heard about this awareness day or holiday before, your piece is not going to convince them to care, right? So that's the big thing, I would say. Yes, this is just the battery example. I love this piece. Thank you, Matthew. So Andrew Maynard wrote this piece when I was still at Future Tense about the depiction of 2022 in Soil and Green. So he wrote it in 2022. That kind of like looking back on historical views of the future as they become the present is something that really works well, I think, within the humanities. This is a great example of striking when your topic is in the news. I think about this all the time. When Scott Pruitt in 2018 complained that the EPA logo looked like a marijuana leaf, Christopher Badanos at New York Magazine wrote this great piece about how it was Neil Gorsuch's mother who actually approved the logo in the 70s. And I remember reading this piece and thinking, why did I not look into when the logo came out? What was I thinking? I'm a terrible editor. And then I realized that Christopher Badanos had written an essay for a reissue of the EPA graphic standards system the year prior. he was the only person in the entire world who could have seen that story and known right away what the piece was. So when your extremely niche idea is out there or something that you know a lot about, be like Christopher. That was genius. I love that piece so very much. This is a great example of sort of humanities. What Killers of the Flower Moon taught my Oklahoma town. So using pop culture as a way to talk about, really important issues. I love that. Lots of people love that. The challenge is finding something people are actually watching or reading rather than something that's kind of really small, unless it's a really undercovered part of pop culture that illuminates something much bigger that people are interested in. So navigating that kind of pop culture news is something that I really love. I read a piece just this week on the fall of the House of Usher. I don't know if anyone has watched that on Netflix. It's fantastic, but directed by Michael Flanagan, who does these great adaptations for Netflix around Halloween every year. And it's sort of a retelling of Poe involving a Sackler family and the opioid crisis. And I found an advocate who lost a son to OxyContin to write about the series and this sort of like using horror to explain the horror that his family had gone through. And that was really wonderful. It was a great experience working with him. So I think there's lots of ways to use that. I really loved this piece from the Boston Globe about drowning in historical fiction. It's another kind of great example of pop culture and humanities research coming to the fore. As I said, not every piece needs a news peg. It can be useful. Other modes, though, can include first-person experiences, so sort of a personal essay, historical pieces. I love using history to illuminate what's happening in the present, and conversations that haven't broken through the public yet, though, as I said earlier, we do have to be careful with those not to get into kind of hypothetical harm, fear-mongering territory, and also people just kind of like skimming past. So it's a difficult balance, but it's something worth thinking through. This is a nice example from the Boston Globe ideas section of a piece of history writing that I really enjoyed, sort of looking back at something that got a lot of attention in the past and most people have forgotten about or never knew about. So revisiting those episodes. I think there's like a little bit of there's this kind of like historical reconsideration industry that's largely popular on podcasts like You're Wrong About, but I think also shows up in this kind of popular journalism too that can be worth being part of. All right, so I'm going to hand it back to Andres.
Yeah, so the importance of one ideally surprising idea. I love that Torie, when she was sketching this out, thought that this was something to include. And I always think back to, I call it the Phil Boffey rule. So Phil Boffey was the deputy editorial page editor at the New York Times when I showed up to work there as an editorial writer in 2000. And Phil Boffey was at a central casting. If you think of sort of a mid-20th century newspaper room, movie, like Phil Boffey's in it, like the crusty, sort of cynical, but very competent, very sharp editor. And I was so intimidated. I mean, I'd written editorials in Pittsburgh, and now I was at writing for the New York Times, not just writing in the New York Times, but literally for the New York Times in that voice of God. And it was very intimidating, and I was like trying way too hard, and this is something that I think is also worth always thinking about as a writer, like the need to be natural. And for academics, often we're going to talk a lot about this too, like to sort of tone it down and be more casual. Well, I was trying to ramp it up, right? Because I felt like, oh my gosh, voice of God, New York Times, and so I was performing. I was almost like acting in my writing. And so Phil Boffey, after a couple weeks, called me in, and he kind of chewed me out by basically saying, dude, you're trying too hard. And you're writing these editorials where you're trying to like make too many points. And the line he said always stayed with me. He said, "A great editorial makes 1 point, if that." And the if that was very Phil Boffey. But I was like, oh my gosh, if I'm writing about topic X, because it's the New York Times, I have to pack in everything, and I have to show my math, and I have to, and it was it was way too much. And so I think when Torie talks about making one idea, that's really important. One way to think about it is, if I'm reading a column in today's New York Times, I should be able to tell Torie, this person wrote this great guest essay, as we now call them, and she pointed out this one thing about what's happening between, in Gaza, the tragedies in Gaza, adding one thing that I just didn't know about. You're not going to read a guest essay of 800 words in the New York Times that's going to explain all there is to know about that, right? This is an ongoing thing. And what is the one, often we're looking for an additional way of looking at something, an argument that maybe you feel is missing, that maybe, but it's the writing is going to be far more effective if you know the one argument you're trying to make, right? And avoid having this idea of the point you're trying to make isn't that this is just important, that we need to further examine this. I mean, there was a convention among sort of op-eds, official sounding op-eds in like the Washington Post back in the day, where notable people would write and say we need to have a commission to look further into this, or the next couple of years will be decisive. Like that goes back to this idea of how unsatisfying it is to actually take a position or to be advancing an argument. As Torie mentioned, the idea of trying to surface something that I care about, that you don't care about, and you should care about, it doesn't quite work, right?
Yeah, I think that can be a hidden secondary argument in many of these pieces.
But you have to show me why.
Right.
You can't just be an exhortation.
Yeah, we need to have a conversation about, which I have always talked about, because I get, in my future tense days, I would get several pitches along those lines from academics every single week, because it's a way to sort of try to make an argument but distance yourself, right? You're not having to take a position, so I understand why it's very tempting. But people don't want to read that. It's just not interesting. So the piece needs to have a different primary argument, and then the secondary argument that you don't make explicitly, but you prove through your engaging writing and evidence and use of examples, is this is really interesting and important and you should care. But you just, that can't be the main point. And even with an explanatory piece like at the conversation, so when we talk about opinion, it doesn't have to necessarily be this is terrible or this is great. It can be people are missing this part, right? And that can be historical, that can be why something that seems like a great idea is actually more complicated, why something seems like a complicated idea is actually not. But it just needs to be have some sort of force and oomph behind it besides, here's the important thing.
Yeah, and relatedly, preaching to the choir, repeating conventional wisdom. I'm still surprised at the number of pitches that we receive where I read the pitch and I'm like, who would disagree with this? I mean, who among us, and who among like Slate readers, like maybe in a completely different publication. But if your pitch is we need to care about the equity in how we apply technology, like at this point for Slate's readership, like that's pretty much set as conventional wisdom. If you want a provocative pitch to me that we shouldn't care, like I might consider that, and it's going to be an interesting argument, and probably going to disagree with it, and I might not publish it. But if a piece is worth running in a publication like the ones we're discussing, it's because there is some underlying controversy. There needs to be conflict. You're taking a position on something that people care about, and it's being debated and it's being discussed, or it needs, further, or you need to provide further context on something because it's not understood. But that already also presupposes conflict and tension because you're telling people they're not focusing on the right thing. And the last sort of tip about thinking of the headline is interesting. It goes back to, it's kind of related to whether you can tell your friend or your colleague that whether it's your piece or something you read makes this one point, right? Writing headlines is sort of a strange art form, and different publications take radically different approaches, as you can probably tell just from reading different publications. But in your own mind, kind of what is the takeaway? What is the headline is a good way to think about. Because if you are considering writing something that is going to be, 1,000, 1,500 words, or you've read something of that length, and you can't distill it into sort of like the one big takeaway, there's probably a problem there.
This is just an example I really like from Undark, which is a really great sort of medical and science publication out of MIT, saying there's a moral panic over misinformation. That's sort of like a corrective to conventional wisdom is always going to be way more interesting than misinformation is a problem, right? It's been 7 years. No one disagrees that misinformation is dangerous, except for apparently Joanna Thompson, and that made me want to read it. I want to read why she thinks it's not as bad as people think it is. So, use your expertise to kind of like tamp down. I love covering a moral panic that is not necessary. I think those are some of my favorite styles of piece.
Just, along those lines, because I did read something in, I don't know where you position Eon magazine.
Love, yeah.
Yeah, but there was something written the other day about basically the demise of philosophy, and by somebody who was not a philosopher, and from reading the article, really knew nothing about what philosophers are doing now, and yet, had a bunch of philosophy, like was saying, Spinoza, saying the right words, but. And there's a lot of now people in philosophy who are like, what the hell? This is so wrong. But I was thinking how did they, it sounds jazzy to say some whole field is dying or whatever, is imploding. But why would you get somebody in media studies to write? That is he doesn't lie that he's not a philosopher. But I was just sort of wondering, because I thought that was I enjoy that publication.
Yeah, I love them. I think one thing is you say, well, why would you get this guy to write it? I suspect he pitched it rather than them reaching out to him. And it does generally work both ways. And at some point we can talk about, what to do if someone reaches out to you, if someone like me reaches out and says, hey, would you be interested in writing about this? So I suspect he pitched it, and they were probably just taken by how provocative it was. And we're going to talk about pitching in a few minutes, about how a pitch should always sort of include why I'm the person to write the piece. Mm-hmm. I would be very interested to see what why I should be the person to write the piece was like. Because normally I often get pitches from people, and then I think, I really don't think that necessarily a psychology professor is the person to be writing about biotech regulation. I don't know. So that is something that people look for. Sometimes, frankly, being provocative, and maybe, the editor was someone who was interested in philosophy and just thought it sounded interesting. So much of this is really subjective. And I will say, too, that within journalism, sort of the standards for who can have a say is very different than the standards for who has a say.
Peer review, I guess.
Yes.
Because it was suddenly wow, okay, I'm going to write about some other field.
Exactly. Right. And and honestly, in journalism, that's often seen as okay, right? If it's an argument that the editor feels is well supported and says something, and frankly, will get people talking, right? If you're all mad, that's better than writing a philosophy's doing okay article that no one reads.
Nobody thinks that.
Right.
And I don't mean that we have really only people can talk about philosophy, but it's just so there's so many things about it that people now in the philosophy kind of blogosphere are it's clear this person doesn't know what's going on.
I mean, and that might be, talking about putting in, sort of orienting a piece in discourse, you might want to maybe pitch the Chronicle of Higher Education for some.
Defense.
Yes, a defense of philosophy. And I would recommend that be written by one person rather than 20, because I get a lot of pitches from 20 people at a time. It's a press release, not an opinion piece. But yeah, I think that's part of it is also, too, that within journalism, I think someone who has a bachelor's in in something might be okay to write something that if I asked a PhD to write, I don't know, they might say, well, my expertise is in 1860s literature, not 1850s literature. That sort of idea of who has a say in journalism.
It's so
and
different.
The public. In a lot of ways, I like to think of this sort of writing as being the general education requirement version of the class rather than the graduate seminar. So like, if a first-year grad student could teach the course, I would probably let a first-year grad student write a really
Right.
entry-level version of the piece, because just the expertise standards are so
If you're a French historian and you have something interesting to say about Napoleon, because the big movie's coming out on Thanksgiving, like the op-ed editor at the Washington Post is not going to be like, but you wrote your dissertation on 20th century France, right?
Right.
So it's like the whole credentialing thing. I ran into this recently with a response essay. So one of the things we do at Future Tense is we publish speculative fiction once a month with our friends at the Center for Science and the Imagination. So, and then we have a response essay by an expert. So we had a pretty far out there story last year about brain implants in this preschool. And I found this neuroscientist at University of California, San Francisco, who was kind of very excited about, because I reached out and said, would you write a response to this, short story sci-fi? And he was like, a lot of people say, no, why would I do that? But he seemed very into it. But he read the story and he's like, well, I haven't done work directly on this type of implant. I'm like, you're a neuroscientist. You're qualified. Because he did have something he wanted to say, but he was very careful about, I'm not, and again, the standards are very different.
It's true. Yeah. So really briefly, how to think about audience. This goes back to smart friends and family members. I think a lot of the time people want to write the piece for the New York Times so that their, advisor from grad school 15 years ago will email them and say, that was so smart. And this is not the venue in which to impress your former advisor. This is the venue to impress the babysitter, the people who are skeptical that all of this is interesting. You are just, again, this is the entry-level general education version rather than the master's seminar. You are not going to get into the layer of nuance that will impress your colleagues, and that is okay. And people talk about this sort of writing is dumbing it down, and I really hate that that's considered a pejorative, because it's making it accessible. Something isn't dumb just because more people can understand it. It's really hard to do this kind of writing. It takes a particular kind of expertise to be able to shed the jargon and do the sort of explain it to a smart high school student. So I think it really demonstrates intellectual heft to be able to write this in a way that can appeal to more people. It's also useful to think about this as a gateway drug. I often run pieces that are related to a research study or a journal article, and we embed the link to the journal article in the piece. And then so anyone who is qualified or wants to be qualified to get the higher level version can open that door and get more information. And we're going to be talking more about sources too. Yeah.
You also say this is a good time, if you have a book about to come out or coming out, this is a good time to place an article.
Yes.
Get the hook or the peg because of that link.
Absolutely. When I was at Slate, because we had a deal with Amazon to get a cut of anytime someone bought a book, so I could see how many people bought books based on excerpts or related essays that we ran, and it was a lot. It could be dozens from a single essay or hundreds from a single essay, and that's extraordinary. I mean, that helps get so much more attention out there on your topic. Any other questions about audience? So we're going to talk more about structure and writing style in a little bit, but I guess my last point. Oh, please.
Okay, yeah, it might be assumed that the editors then are thinking in this way as well. You're right, so you're not pitching at the editor, but you're clear about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I often think of myself as an advocate for the reader. So your editor is not going to know what you know about your topic, and that's totally fine because your reader won't either. And looking back on it, when I first started doing this kind of editing, I let a lot of errors slip through in a piece because I was nervous to have, an astrophysicist know that I didn't know what he was talking about. And inevitably, that was where there was a problem. The place where I stumbled and said, I'm too dumb and uneducated to understand why this is correct, was always where we had to make a correction. That people are going to ask questions, your editor will ask questions that you will think, well, you should know this. And they may sort of know it, but it often, and we'll talk about this part too, when an editor asks questions, it's not like me, a person, asking you, a person, a question. It's me prompting you to make a change within the piece to answer this question that the mythical reader I'm imagining might have as they're reading. So, you're the first person you have to convince this is interesting is going to be the editor. And this actually gets a bit to a point about how different publications are very different. Aeon is going to have different standards for their writer's familiarity with philosophy than, Slate runs a lot of pieces on philosophy, weirdly, but, the New York Times, right? So sort of like the level of expertise you can assume, even among a general interest audience, is going to vary a great deal based on who they think their reader is. Sometimes if you really want to try to be tricky, if you look up like a press kit for a publication, you can often get...
I want to tell everybody your water's off, so there's no water in the bathroom.
Oh,
Thank you. Only the third floor is working now.
God, thank you so much. Good to know.
Upstairs we go.
But yes, so different general interest publications, different standards, often publications will have press kits or brand kits where if you can sort of look that they'll present information about what the demographics of their audience are. These are intended to reach potential advertisers and other sort of business side folks, but often you'll find information there about perhaps the education attainment level of their readers, the age of their readers, that kind of thing. So that can be kind of a way to get a little bit more information about the audience of the particular publication.
I sometimes have to remind myself of this because I'll write frequently about U.S.-Mexico issues in a Mexico City newspaper, and then I'll do it at the LA Times. And so I toggle back and forth that when I'm writing for Reforma, I don't have to explain, that much about who López Obrador is. People are very familiar. And then, when I write for the LA Times, my editor is always reminding me, like, you can't make these, you can't just say, well, back when Mexico was governed by the PRI and move on and not have, like, add a phrase about, what the PRI was and what that was all about. Whereas when I'm writing in Mexico, I can't just have a passing reference to Ted Cruz and not, add the whole thing about. So it is interesting, and it's something that where editors can be really helpful. But going in, it's good to sort of step back and kind of, again, have in mind who's going to be reading this.
Yeah, and just look at other coverage of the same topic within the publication. So how have they explained things to readers previously? This is also really important, and I was going to say this later, but I'll just say it now. Make sure they haven't run your idea already. I get so many pitches that are basically versions of an article I ran a week ago or 6 months ago or whatever. So looking at what they've published before and even reading the publication regularly will help you understand both how they frame things, what level of understanding they appear to have on behalf of their reader, and where you're actually saying something new and not just pitching something they've already run.
And you can use that. You could say, I could reach out to the New York Times next week and say, like, I see that the last time you weighed in on the border in Mexico was the piece that argued X, Y, and Z in August. Last night at the Republican debate, it was stated that this other thing. And so I think this would build upon, or differ from the last thing you did. So again, knowing your audience also includes the person that you're pitching to, the gatekeeper that's going to say, give you a thumbs up or thumbs down.
And honestly, as an editor, I feel a sense of relief when someone demonstrates some familiarity with the publication. It just suggests that it's going to be an easier edit if they seem to know exactly kind of what I'm looking for, the formats we use, those sorts of, sort of silly little things.
Do we need a break?
Yeah, do you want to do you want to do this real quick and then take a break? Because after this is the
Oh, yeah.
structure, and that's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
long, yeah, this one's pretty quick. So how to support your argument. Please don't use footnotes. Then I have to spend all of this time moving your footnotes to the body, and yeah.
Rebecca Altman, who's written for Aeon, actually sticks her references on her personal webpage,
Yeah.
which I think is a brilliant way of
Yeah.
dealing with that.
I think that's great. Most of these sorts of outlets use hyperlinks as sort of informal footnotes. So where you're tempted to put a footnote, just hyperlink it, just put it on the text, Control K. Just as fast as adding a footnote, saves your editor a lot of time, and you don't want an annoyed editor. An annoyed editor.
You're a nice editor if you're doing it. You should
Tell them.
I have kind of a rule of more than 15, I make them do it. Less than 15, I'll do it, but I'm not happy about it.
So when I did the conversation, they wanted, where possible, the hyperlinks to not go to something behind a paywall.
Yes, generally.
Basically means all of academia is out.
Yeah. So, I want the link there. If the only link is a paywalled link, I'd rather have the link just so someone hypothetically could access it. But if there is a free version, I'd rather go to the free version for sure. And sometimes people put papers on their personal websites, right? So you don't necessarily always have to go through the journal. But really, anytime you're linking to talking about research, an example, a news story, there should be a link. Now, you don't need to link to definitions, like very basic definitions, or things like that. You don't need to link to every single thing that you might in a journal article. But really, anytime someone might say, well, I'd like to know where they got that piece of information, I think that's a great time for a link. But you don't need to do a literature review. I used to get lots and lots of pieces from academics that would contain like 3 paragraphs about every academic who had ever written about anything related. And then people would get very upset when I took them out because it would seem rude, frankly, right? Or a violation of academic norms not to acknowledge people who had written something semi-related. But this is journalism, it's not academia. And, I know you might not like that norm, but our readers are not going to read through, 3 paragraphs of name checking. So try to keep it tight, try to only link to places and mention sources that are really relevant to your argument, not just the topic, which is something we'll talk about a bit. Supporting your argument also means engaging with your critics, real or imaginary. Where might someone reading disagree who has published a piece that explicitly disagrees with what your argument is? Definitely mention and link to where applicable. And this goes back to our bigger point, to put your argument in the context of the broader conversation. So, as Andrés said, someone should disagree with what you're writing, with anything with any sort of opinion piece or even analysis piece. So who are they? What are you saying that's different from what the reader might already think? And that's going to be really critical to a good faith argument. I get lots of submissions from people that don't acknowledge the weakness in the argument, and that makes it boring, and it means I don't understand exactly why we're bothering to write. Any questions on supporting your argument or linking? All right, well, let's take a quick break. 5 minutes. This is just an example of good linking.
Good linking
Good linking.
practices.
And now how to structure an opinion piece. Oh, sorry.
All right, we're going to do this together because Torie is the expert on structure. So I think a lot of the publications that we have been talking about, usually the pieces are in this ballpark of length, but obviously there's quite a bit of variance. You can write a 5,000, 10,000 word piece for the New Yorker too. But generally, what's that?
Or the New York Times might require 750.
Yes.
So, but since we mostly seem to be talking about more sort of online outlets, my preferred length is 1,000 words, if that means anything to anybody.
Yeah. More important than the length, we've talked some about this, is you want to have a compelling, ideally surprising argument. It needs to be informal in tone, perhaps an anecdotal introduction. And then when you think about the anecdotal introduction, or the introduction we'll talk a little bit more about, the jargon in our world, Torie said, like, journalists don't like jargon unless it's their own, is the lead. And this, I think it all gets back to this idea that if you're a general interest publication, you don't have a captive audience. Even in the old days, if I'm on the subway in New York, it's pretty easy for me to turn the page. But it was a lot stickier back then because I didn't have my phone, but I could still turn the page, right? But nowadays, it's like you have a few seconds to grab the reader, and you have to keep the reader, right? So if you're going to name check a lot of academic colleagues, or have an additional paragraph that kind of doesn't advance your argument in a compelling way, I'm clicking off. So it's that idea of, and a lot of times when I talk about this with serious academics like yourselves, I get defensive and I start feeling like those of us who come from the media journalism world are kind of shallow and we have short attention spans, and but that's a bit the nature of the game. But again, it's this idea of not having a captive audience. So a lot of when I edit pieces from anyone, not just academics, a lot of it is about the pacing.
And I would say we literally have programs, Chartbeat, Parsely, these analytic programs, and we can see literally how long readers are spending on the page. If an article has an average engagement time, meaning active on the page, not just like a tab hiding for you to read in 8 weeks or whatever. If it has we've all been there. If it has a 15-second engagement time, that means people are getting a couple sentences in and leaving. And that is like, when you've spent a lot of time working on an article, I don't tell writers when they have a 15-second engagement time, but I'm sad. I want people to stay on your page. And this is one reason why editors are such jerks about keeping the pace moving, is because, it doesn't mean anything that you've retained all the nuance of your original argument if no one reads it, right? Like, the goal has to be to get people to the end. And so, we can see that people made it to the 4th paragraph. There are heat maps on these programs that show exactly when people are checking out. So,
which is really scary.
Yeah.
But so yes, you need to sort of grab the reader by the lapels, have this compelling intro. So I read so many pieces or pitches, submissions that will have a throat-clearing introduction. When our students write papers, it's often like, since the beginning of time, It's like that voice of God overview when you go to see a movie, like in a time when, But oftentimes when it's more of a sort of seasoned academic, it's the, my essay will argue the 3 following things, and I used to be one of those students in law school doing law review articles, and there's that formula, right? Like, there is no room for that in this kind of general interest publication. Like, oftentimes when we taught a class at Cronkite, I would tell our students, your piece should not survive decapitation. What I meant like that is if I cut the first paragraph or 2 and the rest of it makes sense, that paragraph or 2 shouldn't be there. It should be one continuous argument that builds, right? We just don't have the space or the time or the reader's attention to have sort of like a scene-setting introduction that's not going to be compelling and start advancing the argument. And I think one of the most difficult things in this type of writing is learning how, and I still struggle with this, and I do it when I edit myself, weaving the kind of background information that the reader needs with the advancement of the argument. Because what you don't have when you're writing a 900 to 1,200 word piece is you don't have the space to step back and write my 3-paragraph explaining who López Obrador is if I'm writing about Mexico. I kind of have to weave it in as I'm advancing the argument with a parenthetical here or there. And that's always one of the tricks of editing, is how much context and background, and editors will help with that, right? But what you can't do is have an introductory space where I'm going to tell you where Mexico is and its whole history before I really get to tell you what the person in the debate said was wrong. Thesis paragraph, this is kind of like, I think we're in the English building, right? So that concept still applies in this type of writing. And I know Torie is a big stickler for having a thesis paragraph, so you're not going to get away with not having one?
And I always want a really strong statement of that thesis at the end of that paragraph. And there are times when you can sort of bust out of these conventions, but generally I think with this kind of writing, what most is effective for readers is not saying in this piece I will, but doing that really strong, clear statement of what you are arguing at the end of that thesis paragraph. That is sort of like the stamp on what we're going to do. So,
And you can assert it and then back it up, right?
Right,
And I think
exactly,
sometimes academics are a little shy of doing that, right?
Yeah, I think, there's this sort of cliche within editing opinion pieces where often the first thing you do is chop off the first paragraph because it's throat clearing, and then you take the conclusion and move it to be your thesis paragraph, right? So people often want to build to that conclusion, but really, as I say, we want the spoiler alert. People need you to tell them what you're proving and then walk them through it.
And how you end a piece is always, I think, challenging because I think we're sort of conditioned in academia to sort of want to come back and sum up the argument once more. And again, in this type of pieces with this kind of space and pacing, that doesn't really work to sort of go back and reassert like the original thesis or to sum things up. And the jargon in the news in media is the kicker. And I almost think it's like the challenge of how do I dismount? How do I get off? And not just have an abrupt end or have this sort of pat conclusion. And so that's the last column I wrote for Reforma just earlier this week. The editor said, the end feels a little bit it needs to be punchier, and I'm always frustrated because for that column, because it's still appearing in print in Mexico City, there is no give. There's it has to be, and they're very short. It's 657 words, and if I send them 680, I'm in trouble, right? And so I was kind of well, easy for you to say I don't have a punchy end. I packed all this in and I got no. And then I looked at it and I thought if I flip the last two sentences, I can do this. But it doesn't. It's still a struggle sometimes. Sometimes there's something that just comes so natural and it's great and we'll talk a little bit with some examples. But yeah.
When you hear the phrase the nut graph, is that the argument?
That's the thesis paragraph. Yeah, it's. And graph spelled with an F. I'm sorry. It's
yes.
awful. It's
and lead is L-E-D-E.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in news writing, that would be sort of the main point. So just sort of grafted opinion on it.
So this is something I just have fun with when I teach writing at Cronkite. I don't know. I'm sure many of you, most of you, recognize the first line. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember the distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. Anyone? Where's that from? It's the first line of 100 Years of Solitude. And I think it's one of the, and then we have, it's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. I mean, we could come up with 20 great examples of a first line of a book. The 100 Years of Solitude, I think, is so brilliant because it's in one line, you've got the present, the future, and the past, and you know that in the future there's a firing squad, and in the past you discovered ice. You're what is happening? And the only reason I love sharing these is to just sort of reinforce the fact that even these classic novels that are hundreds of pages long, these authors put a lot of thought into the way into the story, right? And presumably they had more of a captive audience than your column on Slate that I can click away from in a nanosecond. If I've bought the book and I'm sitting there in the 19th century and I don't know how many books I'm going to have in my cabin, I'm kind of a captive audience. And yet that amount of thought into I'm going to grab you and start the story. So it's kind of, I'm not saying that you need to come up with this type of a lead. I'm not setting the bar there. I'm just saying. So this lead, try to remember the ordinary if you can, is very powerful to me because I was at the New York Times on 9/11, and we were scrambling to figure out, if we were going to survive the day, but also we had to put out the next day's newspaper and explain the biggest news story ever. And I was on the editorial pages. And so the next day's editorial, which took up the whole space, was a team effort. And we had a wonderful writer on the editorial board named Verlin Klinkenborg, who also wrote a signed column on gardening. But he was sort of our poet on the editorial board. And this was the lead to the New York Times' unsigned editorial the next day, on September 12th. And it's tone perfect. I get goosebumps just thinking about that day. So here is just quickly some examples. This is a lead from a piece this week in the New York Times by Patty Davis on Matthew Perry's tragic death. And again, I mean, look at this lead. A long time ago, I lay awake for hours, terrified that they would be my last ones on Earth. So, I mean, that's very evocative. I want to keep reading, right? Now it's a pieces are different in their types. I mean, Torie has referenced the first-person pieces are by their nature there's a lot of latitude there, but that's a very powerful lead. I like this example this is a Washington Post op-ed also from this week by Ted Widmer. Ron was talking about when you have a book coming out, it's a great peg. So Ted Widmer wrote a book, he published a book recently looking at October 73, when the wheels really came off. And so he's looking, tragically for the world, luckily for his book, October of 2023 has been a pretty horrific month, right? I mean, he couldn't have known that was going to happen. He couldn't have planned it. But he's using the mirroring, the echo of that as a peg. So you can, I'm not going to read it, but you can see that he's playing off what's happening now to sort of promote the importance of this, what he considers a pivotal kind of game changer of a month that just so happened it was 50 years ago exactly. That's a decent lead that kind of gets you going. But one thing I thought was interesting was when I then looked at the sidebar on the opinion page of the plug for the article, so some editor just came up with this promo line, think this October has been brutal, you should have been here 50 years ago. And I was thinking, that's a heck of a lead. Like, I mean, the one Ted had is fine, but that this is kind of what we're like punchy and grabbing your attention. And again, sometimes we feel like, well, this might be it's too much, it's too gimmicky, it's not me. But I think there's a way in which you need to sort of think about grabbing people's attention, because in that one website on that given day, they're going to have hundreds of options. Of other pieces they can click to, or they can look at their phone, or it's uncomfortable that we have to think that way, but I think that's where we are. So I wrote a piece about peg to Ted Lasso. This is something I wrote for the LA Times, and it's just another example of pegs, because what I really want to write about is related to my book project, which Ron generously said I was completing. It's more like starting. It's been a slow start. But I'm really interested in sort of the globalization of sport, how America engages with the rest of the world through sport, this kind of tension between us being the sort of center of global pop culture, except when it comes to sport, like Hollywood music, but when it comes to sport, the default global sport is one that we were allergic to and resisted up until very recently. And so I wanted to write about this for the LA Times, and if I had just sort of lobbed this over, like, hey, reader, you should care about our relationship with soccer and all these great thoughts I have about the globalization of sport, they would have said, like, thanks, this is a great idea, not for us. But Ted Lasso was about to get I don't know how many Emmys, and so that was kind of my peg. And actually, when I was thinking about sort of the way in which Apple, to brand itself globally, chose to make a show about soccer and not baseball, it was kind of like advancing the point that I was trying to make. So this was sort of my lead, and again, this is not a particularly great lead, but I think, my using Ted Lasso as a vehicle to talk about the sort of underlying stuff that I would have wanted to write about, even had Ted Lasso not ever been made, is a way to think about using these sort of pop culture pegs that Torie referenced. And I'm saying that English football needs sort of the platform of American pop culture to have that reach, but the platform of American media needs the global sport. And so that's why I'm saying it's a match made in sort of globalizer heaven. So back to the nut graph, your thesis, what is the crux of your argument? Have you prominently articulated in the piece? Back to Patty Davis's Matthew Perry article. She's very direct. I want to tell you something about addiction. No matter who it is or what substance that person is hooked on, loneliness is at its root. So again, if I were telling Torie, I read this very powerful piece by Patty Davis, I would say, she convinced me that no matter who you are, these mental health issues, at the core, it's always about loneliness. There was a very clear one idea, and she was using her own personal experience to sort of advance that argument. And so this is a very clear, probably clearer than mine, argument that's right here. And you don't always have to write, this is what I'm going to argue, but in this case, it worked well. This is back to my Ted Lasso piece. Further down, this was sort of like my attempt. I think if Torie had been my editor, we would have had a stronger nut graph. But I was trying to sort of say that this match is, Ted Lasso is here to mind the gap between America's dominance over most forms of global pop culture and its historical isolation when it comes to sport, which is sort of like the argument I was making. And getting at the kicker, we don't want to summarize the previous argument or restate the thesis. And so when I wrote about Ted Lasso, here's the last paragraph. And this is something that often works where you're looking forward. So, the whole premise of Ted Lasso is the wackiness of an English soccer team having an American coach. And yet this is happening at a time when most of these big English clubs are being taken over by American owners. Very few American coaches, but because of the way in which sport is globalizing and American sporting interests want to have a global brand, business now, they're buying into European soccer. I say because of what I've been arguing, I say perhaps season 3 of Ted Lasso, because this is before season 3, will involve a takeover of the club by a group of US investors. And that would be kind of more resonant with what's actually happening. So I was sort of like taking the argument that I had made and then projecting forward. Similarly, Ted Widmer's piece about October 73, playing off what's happening today, he does the same thing. He's saying, okay, I've been telling you about the sort of bookend of my October 73, which was the Yom Kippur War and the Saturday Night Massacre with Watergate. But now he's looking forward. So we've had this harrowing half century between the subject of my book, the current nightmarish month that we've experienced, and what's going to happen in the next 50 years, looking forward. You don't want to force it, but these are two examples where it sort of worked. Yeah. Do you want to say anything else about kickers?
I avoid
or like how you end.
I would avoid saying we'll see what happens next, which is something I often have to edit out, which is when someone really
don't
runs
literally
out of steam.
say it. Yeah.
Happens all the time. Also, I love an anecdotal lead. I also love an anecdotal kicker. If you're really struggling, ending on another sort of anecdote that illustrates your point. I work with a lot of doctors, of people in biotech, pieces that can often start to really easily forget about the humanity they're actually discussing. And so starting and ending with humans is very appealing to me. Things like that. So yeah, punchy language, looking forward. Don't call for people to sign petitions. It's really boring. Yeah.
So that was a really clear structure for opinion piece. Is that same for pieces?
Yeah, I think it generally works for, I mean, really, I think any kind of piece that you all would be writing is really analytical at its heart. And so all the analytical stuff, I think, applies to this too. So even if it's explanatory in the conversations approach, I think that you could probably pick a random conversation article and it would probably roughly graph onto that structure too. You know, frankly at heart, this is the 5-paragraph essay that you learn in middle school, but like, you know, there's a reason that works. So every time I hear someone denigrate the 5-paragraph essay, I'm like, no, stop, I need that. Yeah, it works. All right, so
There's no kicker in the 5-paragraph.
No, but there should be. English teachers are
6 paragraph.
missing something, yes. All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left, and so I'm going to kind of try to blast through some tips on writing style, on pitching, and then working with an editor. So forgive me if this gets a little rapid fire. So as you're writing, I often say, and this is probably unfair of me, to try to write like a human being. I spent a lot of time at Future Tense. I was there for about 12 years, and in that time, I saw such wonderful writers start their PhD programs, and then by like year 3 or 4, I was like, what happened to you? You were so great, as they start to kind of like internalize the academic style. So often my job is to try to shake people out of it. And there are a few ways to do that. Avoid the jargon. If no one outside of your field knows what you're talking about, your reader's not going to know what you're talking about. This is tricky, but you want to either define terms or just not use them. Really try to use active voice. This is something that scientists are often very reluctant to do. They love to use the passive voice to avoid assigning responsibility, but it just makes your writing feel very passive. And we really want this kind of writing to feel energetic, and it's got some motion and emotion behind it. So using the active voice helps tremendously. Mix up your word choice. Don't use the same word 3 times in 2 sentences. Try not to use it twice in 2 sentences. The more you kind of use the same terminology over and over, the more the writing gets kind of weighted down and it doesn't have that kind of propulsion. So and try to do that. You don't want to be like overly precious about it. People often like to replace said with noted or explained. Like, just say said. It's totally fine. We don't need to go like too dramatic, but mixing up that word choice helps a lot. Use contractions. This sounds so ridiculous, but I swear it makes your writing just feel more conversational. And that's what we're going for, is smart conversation with a friend. So using those contractions will automatically be a little bit helpful. Vary your sentence length and structure. So, try not to just do like super long sentence after super long sentence. That's going to feel a little bit tricky too, so mix that whole thing up. Keep coming back to examples. Again, the more human this piece feels, the more it's going to connect with your human reader. So especially as you find yourself kind of wandering off into the esoteric, that's then a really great chance to kind of pull it back to what this means for the real world and for actual people. Embrace the I. You don't want to say I think a lot, because this is an opinion or analysis piece. It is understood that you think the thing you are asserting, so you don't need to waste time on that. But if there's a reason to talk about why you started caring about this field, if there's a reason to share an anecdote, please do. I think it's really helpful for readers to remember that you, the human being, are writing it. And then, just as we said before, ask yourself, how do I talk about this when I'm talking to someone who needs some convincing that is interesting? So if you have had a Thanksgiving in which, your uncle is sort of like, well, I don't know about that PhD thing, what are the examples that you come back to convince them that this is actually so exciting? Lean on that. I think everyone, or how do you convince a class of first-year students at 9 in the morning to try to engage? There's a little bit of an entertainment factor in all of this, and I think it's okay to admit that. Any quick writing style questions? This is just a first-person piece I recently published on Stat. I won't go through it because we don't have tons of time, but She's an academic and researcher who coined the phrase patient in waiting to refer to how new technologies and tests are creating people who just have to spend time waiting and seeing what's going to happen, which is really deeply stressful. She coined the term several years ago, and now her husband, thanks to new testing, is waiting to see if he has a recurrence of his colon cancer. So she's writing about this mixture of how her own research has inflected the experience she and her husband are going through now. It's a very personal piece. It's also very applicable to many people. So it's just a great example of using I and then writing in a really engaging way. It's one of those pieces I had to make very few changes to, which, you know, I'm kind of lazy. I'd rather publish stuff I don't have to edit really hard, you know? So editors don't like making changes just for the sake of it. You know, we really love to see a piece that comes in great shape. All right, pitching, and we are going to talk about a lot more about this in the afternoon for those of you who are sticking around. So every publication has a different process. Some places prefer a pitch, which is a 1 to 2 paragraph sort of pitch saying, this is what I want to write. Some places prefer a completed version of the article. The Washington Post does, I believe the New York Times does, Stat does, though I'm a little bit of a pushover on that. Slate really prefers a pitch. I think Zocalo prefers a pitch. If you Google the outlet name and submission guidelines or pitching guidelines, you will often find something about what it is exactly that they're looking for. So definitely do that. If they want a pitch, again, 1 to 2 paragraphs, you're going to outline the argument and what is special about it, so orienting it to the public discourse. Remember, this has to be the argument and not the topic. I get so many submissions and pitches that are about the topic. I want to write about cancer tests. What are you going to say about cancer testing? You know, I need to know exactly what it is. Again, the spoiler alert. Why are you the person to make it? So we can avoid the media studies folks who should not be talking about philosophy being the one to make it. I want to know, is this something that you've researched, that you have personal experience with? Why are you the person who I really want to hear from now? Are you the secret expert on EPA logos, like the New Yorker editor guy? Is it timely? Is there a reason why people care right now? And if there's not, why should we talk about this, even if it's evergreen? How fast can you move? If this is newsy, I might want it tomorrow. I might want it in 2 days. Next week is going to be too late. So make sure that you can commit to a time frame and tell them what that it is. Are you about to hop on a plane to India? I'm dealing with a writer who just left for India on a slightly time-sensitive piece, and we're trying to make it work. So, you know, what is going on? Will you be able to work with me on it intensely if this is newsy? And include a sparkling concrete example. I just got a pitch yesterday from someone saying, I will include examples of this. Like, well, tell me one. You know, I need the spoiler. I need to know what you're going to do. And show me what a beautiful writer you are. Write it in the way that you're going to write the piece, in that engaging, exciting style. So the Open Notebook, which I'm biased, I'm a freelance editor for them, but it's a website about the practice of science journalism. I think it's also applicable to lots of journalism outside of science journalism. And they have this beautiful pitch database with more than 200 successful pitches, the outlets that accepted them, a link to the final article. It is so worthwhile. I have some examples here, but we're not going to go through them. But they're really wonderful. If you want to look through there for successful pitches, you'll notice they have the examples. When you are pitching, I get so many emails from someone saying, may I pitch you a piece? Like, just send it. Like, what do you think I'm going to do if you send it without telling me? Like, don't make me respond to you and hit archive.
Like, can I email you?
Yeah. What the heck? If it's timely, people often ask about timeframes for following up. If it is newsy, feel free to follow up the next day. You know, if it is not newsy, please give me a week or so. You know, often we are discussing it with other editors or with reporters. I often want to get feedback from someone who knows the topic better than I do, so I don't assign something that's really a bad idea without realizing it. So please do give us some time. If you don't hear back, say in 2 weeks or so for a not time-sensitive piece, you know, feel free to say, hey, if I don't hear back from you within however many days, I'm going to take this somewhere else. Having said that, please do try to avoid pitching more than one outlet at a time without disclosing it. It's called simultaneous submission. It's kind of frowned upon, and it's one of those things that's not totally fair to the writer. It's more fair to the editor, but it is, important for me to know so that I can nudge my colleagues to move faster, so that I know to move faster. I think it's fair to do a simultaneous submission in the event of a newsy event in which you need to write really fast. I would just say, because this is time sensitive, I am pitching it to several other outlets, so please let me know immediately. Just be cool. Just tell everyone what's going on so everyone's on the same page. I'm not going to go through the pitches. And then working with the editor. So every outlet operates a little bit differently. Feel free to ask about the process as soon as you get the green light from an editor. I will say too, often with a pitch, the writer or the editor might come back to you and say, oh, this is, we ran something similar. This is again where, as Andrés said, point out anything similar that you've noticed they published. Generally, the search functions on these sites are terrible. I highly recommend using Google instead. So like, for instance, just, liquid cancer biopsy, site:/statnews.com is going to give you much more results than searching for the same phrase on statnews.com would. And then, reference that in the pitch. But, even if you think you've been really thorough in taking your sort of trip to see similar coverage both in the outlet and elsewhere, the editor might still come back and say, well, The Atlantic ran this piece 2 months ago, and what's going to be different about it? They might say, well, this argument feels familiar, but there's this part at the end. Would you be interested in doing that? So you might have some back and forth. Once you get the assignment, feel free to ask about process. Feel free to ask questions about the contract. Most of these places will have a contract for you to sign. Feel free to ask about pay. You generally won't get it, but maybe you'll get $250 or something. It's always worth asking. Places generally won't say no just because you asked. It's your name that's on the piece, so if you think an error has been introduced, please feel free to speak up. I will say generally, I would recommend against reverting back to the original, because whether the editor made a change well or not, there's a reason they made the change. Whether to make it less clunky, to make it clearer, to make it more conversational or exciting, whatever. But so I'd recommend trying a third way rather than just kind of reverting to what you had before. This goes back to why I don't like editing lawyers, so I do it all the time, because they do tend to just revert. Like, come on, guys. And then explain why you made the change. I am old-fashioned and I still like to use Word. Lots of people use Google Docs now, much to my dismay, as I have written about for Slate. Those track changes functions always make everything look so much worse than it is. I promise. You may have a heart attack when you open it up, but it's never as bad as it seems. But having said that, if you think something's wrong, it's your name, speak up, but choose your battles wisely. I spend an awful lot of time explaining capitalization changes to people. Like, every outlet has its own style. You capitalize professor, we don't. Just leave it be. Save your firepower for arguing about stuff that actually matters to the argument and to the presentation, not what is capitalized and what is not. And I should say, you may not have a say in the headline. I think it's always fair to ask, will I be able to see the headline? Lots of places, especially more traditional outlets, will not let you see the headline first, and that can be terrifying. I always try to let the writer see the headline and have some input on it, but we have to make decisions based on what's going to get eyeballs on social media, on what's going to be search engine optimization friendly. So it can go either way there.
What's the rationale for not?
Plausible deniability is a big part of it. If there's a headline that they think is really going to work for a piece, I think it's kind of fair for the writer not to see it, and then that way they can tell everybody, well, I didn't write it. So there's that. I think is part of it. Sometimes, especially if you need to move quickly, getting bogged down in a fight on the headline can really interrupt the workflow. So there's that, and 1,000 other reasons. Also, sometimes, the headline can change last minute. I don't know, the editor-in-chief might see it and say that's a terrible headline, change it. And in that case, you don't want to go back and forth to it might be 9 p.m. and it's publishing the next morning. The contract at Stat for our freelance opinion contributor says, you may not see the headline. We reserve the right to have the headline. I still try to show it to everybody, but
I can't, I mean, even knowing this well and having been on the inside, I can't tell you how many times I really dislike the headline on a piece that I've written. But I kind of, I know what I'm getting into. I think there was one time when I got a headline changed, but generally, yeah, this tends to be a surprise. I mean, sometimes, a lot of times we'll have people will submit a piece and there will be a headline on it, and you're kind of like, oh, that's
cute, yeah.
That's cute, yeah. Yeah, so it is always, I think, surprising to people.
I do also, though, recommend, feel free to include a headline with the piece. 95% chance I'm not going to use it, but it's really helpful for me to see what you think the most important part is. And this is also why I often ask people, even when you're submitting a full piece, include a pitch with it, because I really want to know what you think you're arguing. Because sometimes I read a piece and I think you're arguing something completely different. So the more I understand exactly what you're trying to say, the more I can make sure that we're working toward a similar goal and refining something well.
One of the things, and you might have already mentioned this, that I found really interesting is the quick turnaround times and edits. And so I know when if I do a piece, I have to block out a few days, just my schedule has to be a little lighter, because I know I'm going to have to spend some time with the piece. Because otherwise, there's just a turnaround.
Yeah, absolutely, especially if it's timely. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been watching the clock waiting for a professor to get back from a class that I know they're teaching, because I just want to get it, because, also we can't just publish the second I get the final version from you. It has to go through the copy editor and the art team, and, the headline might need a glance. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, so we need to, the more time we have, the better. I know we're getting into lunch now, but are there any final quick questions? I will say, too, for anyone who's not staying on for the afternoon, the cheat sheet that Jake's going to send around later today with a lot of the information from the slides also includes my email address and Andres's. Feel free to ask questions. If anything's unclear, if you've read a piece you really liked or really hated somewhere, I love to see those. Please feel free to send them. And I don't want to volunteer your time, but I'm very happy to be a resource for anybody who would like to.
Likewise. And I was going to just add one quick thing to the pitching element, because you were talking about some places you might send in a pitch, some places you might send in a full draft, but you always need a pitch. Even if you're sending, if I'm lobbing in my 1,200 words on the U.S.-Mexico relationship, I can't assume that the editor is going to sit there and read it. In my email saying I'm attaching this, there's still going to be a pitch, right? I still have to, in one paragraph, tell the editor, sell the piece, even if the piece is attached. The pitch is inescapable.
Yeah. I will say too that we all get a lot of pitches, and so don't feel discouraged if somebody says no. As I get about 25 a day, which means I get more than 100 every single week. Fewer on Fridays, thank God, than I get on Mondays. And I publish 1 to 2 a day, and so that means I say no to some perfectly good pieces. Also, I solicit a lot of pieces. I go to people, so it's not even that you have a 1 in 25 shot on a given day. It can be, I can say no to every piece that gets submitted in a given day. But also, while I like to be a nice person, I'm not going to sort of blow smoke. If I tell you I'm going to pass on this because I don't have the bandwidth, or I have something else in the pipeline that's similar, or whatever the reason is, but please do pitch me again. Please do. Editors mean that. We don't just say that to be nice and spare your feelings. So if someone encourages you to submit again, please do. Also, that does not mean you have to submit again the next day. I can't tell you how many times I've said no, but pitch me again, and then received 5 pitches within the next 24 hours. And inevitably, each one is worse than the last, and that makes me not so inclined. But these are ongoing relationships, right? I've often said no to 3 submissions from somebody over the course of a year, and then the 4th one is perfect. So, try not to get too discouraged and keep coming back, but don't keep knocking on the door on the same day. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.